All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me? Will someone just send a message in the chat? Okay, wow, all at once. All right, great. Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Financial Wellness at Penn's first Financial Fridays of the year. My name is Lindsay Burcham, and I manage the Financial Wellness at Penn program, and I'm excited to talk to you all today about grocery shopping on a budget. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about our program. So Financial Wellness at Penn is a program that intends to help students understand how to manage their personal finances now and in the future after you leave Penn. And given that our mission, which you can see on the screen here, given that our mission is education-based, it's crucial for us to provide a disclaimer that financial education does not solve all money struggles, and we want to acknowledge that up front. So financial education cannot fix poverty or repair damage caused by years of economic injustice. When I was a Penn student, I was a first generation low income student, and I budgeted weekly, and it didn't make me less poor, right? So there are limits to what we can do, but what we can do with financial education is set the record straight on all things finance. We'll help you understand your financial options and sort of how to choose between them. Our goal is to provide you with education to empower you to make the decisions that are best for you when the time comes. Okay. So we like to start all of our workshops by outlining the goals we hope to achieve during the course of our time together today. So first, we're going to talk about the benefits of buying groceries and cooking at home. Then we'll walk you through how to make an effective meal plan. And then lastly, we'll talk about some strategies for successful grocery shopping. And feel free to send questions in the chat throughout the presentation. We'll either address them as they come up or at the end, depending on what they are. So why should you cook at home at all? So let's get the obvious out of the way. It may be necessary now more than ever due to the pandemic. This could be because of quarantine measures and you may be going out less generally, but it also could be because of an economic change that has resulted from the pandemic. It may feel more necessary to cook at home in order to save money. So that brings us to the primary reason to cook at home, which is to save money. So you can take a look at the graph that's on the right. On average, it costs less to buy ingredients and cook at home than it does to order takeout or go to a restaurant. And keep in mind that when you order out, you're not only paying for the food, but also the labor that went into preparing it, which is why it tends to be more expensive. And if you're not totally confident with your cooking skills, meal kit programs could be a good way to get started. On average, they cost less than eating out, but still more than buying your own groceries and cooking yourself. But this gives you the opportunity to spend less on groceries overall while practicing your cooking skills. Another reason to cook at home is that you get to take control over what goes into the food you eat. Now, whether this is a priority to you or not depends, but when you cook at home and you see everything that goes into your meals, you may be able to pay closer attention to your diet and the nutrition of the food that you're consuming if that's something that matters to you. And then the last reason you should cook at home now is because cooking is a valuable and practical life skill that will last with you forever, just like money management skills. So unless you plan to order takeout forever, you should learn some basic cooking skills now. That way you're ready for when you graduate and you're living on your own. Now, the thing I probably hear most often when I talk to students about cooking at home is that they don't have time. And I was a student once. I have been in that position. I totally get it. But trust me, you have more time than you think. Cooking doesn't have to be time intensive. All you need to do is master a few key cooking skills to get you to that effortless point. You can take steps to make it less time intensive, and we'll talk more about that later. Someone submitted a question asking what are/where do you get meal kits? So these are things like HelloFresh or Blue Apron. I'm sure I could think of other examples, but you've probably seen a bunch of ads for them, whether it's like on social media or on TV or whatever it may be. They sort of came up within the past few years, I guess. But basically what you do is you sign up for a subscription to the service and you pick out the meals you're interested in cooking. And what they'll do is they send you the pre-prepared ingredients. So all you have to do is follow the recipe that they send you, but you don't have to do the chopping or measuring out or whatever. Like they give you perfectly portioned amounts of what you need to cook. Great. So what tools and ingredients do you need to be able to cook at home? So first, let's talk about how to stock your kitchen to suit your cooking needs. So there's a list on the screen of the basic tools that you need to cook and eat at home. And before I walk through the list, I want to acknowledge that these things will cost some money up front, but you don't have to spend a ton of money to have the tools that you need. So you could buy cheap tools now to get you through your time as a student. You can always choose to invest in some better tools once you have a full-time job. To be completely honest, that's what I did when I was a student. And then since I've graduated and I cook even more now, I've bought newer versions of those things. So just consider buying the basics to start and purchasing new items over time if you can't stomach the upfront costs. You don't need a ton of kitchen gadgets to be successful when you're cooking. If you keep it simple, you'll find that you can make most meals that you want to. So let's take a look at this list. To cook, you'll need these basics, most likely: a skillet, a saucepan, a stock pot, a sheet pan if you want to cook things in the oven, a cutting board and a good knife, and then some cooking spoons and spatulas. And regarding cooking spoons and spatulas, I'd recommend you get like silicone versions so they don't melt, which is a problem that you could encounter. I've been there. But I would recommend you get at least a slotted spoon and a non-slotted spoon. That way, if you need to like drain things, you have that. And then also a spatula to use to flip things when you're cooking. And I guess like some honorable mentions that are not on this list because they're not completely necessary, but they could be really helpful. I think tongs are a lifesaver in the kitchen. They function almost the same as a spatula, though not exactly the same. Really good for like flipping or mixing things. Some students suggest getting a blender. So we have some folks on our team when we were putting this together who suggested a blender for like making a smoothie in the morning when you're going to class or something, because it can be a really easy way to satisfy breakfast and whatnot. And then the last thing is a slow cooker or an Instant Pot. And if you're worried about that time issue we talked about before, a slow cooker or Instant Pot will totally change the game for you. And if anyone has questions about that, feel free to send it in the chat because I've used both and I'm happy to talk about my experience with both. So the last little section of this list probably goes without saying, but in order to eat the food that you cook, you'll probably want to have at least one plate, bowl, cup, fork, spoon, and knife, whatever you typically eat with. If you have roommates or you're living with family, you'll need multiple of these. Also, having multiple helps you spread out how frequently you do dishes. So completely up to you, but you probably are going to need those things to eat. So next, let's talk about what you should try to keep on hand whenever you're cooking. So on the screen, we've listed some basic items that you should consider keeping stocked in your pantry and refrigerator or freezer. If there are additional items that you cook with frequently, you know that list best, and it's probably a good idea to keep those stocked as well. I have a few things that I typically keep stocked that aren't necessarily on this list, but I wouldn't consider them basics per se. So again, you know better than anyone else what you cook with often and what you need. So stock what you need and don't really worry about the rest. So let's walk through this list together. First, flour and sugar are good to have on hand. You never really know when they'll come up in a recipe that you need. If you bake often, you may also want to keep things like baking powder, baking soda, brown sugar, and vanilla extract around. If you don't bake and you're just here to cook, you probably don't need those things. So don't worry about it too much. Additionally, based on your preferences, you should keep some form of carbs around. So this could be bread, rice, pasta, maybe another grain like quinoa or farro. Grains are super easy to cook in large batches, which we'll talk more about later. And they also have a pretty long shelf life, with the exception of bread, of course. But these are things you can keep on hand so that if you haven't meal planned, like we'll discuss later, you have some things you can fall back on. So you'll also want to keep some oil or butter around for cooking. I'd recommend starting with olive oil and some additional neutral oil of your choice. So that could be something like avocado oil or grapeseed oil or vegetable oil, etc. It's completely up to you. I do want to acknowledge that oils tend to feel sort of expensive when you buy them up front, but they do last a long time. So that investment may spread out that cost over the course of a few weeks or maybe months, depending on how often you use it. As for perishable items to keep around, it's a good idea to keep eggs and milk. If you have dietary restrictions that lead you to not consuming those things, you obviously don't need to have those around. There are also plenty of alternatives to both eggs and milk. I personally keep oat milk on hand instead of dairy milk. Completely up to you. And then to create simple meals when you maybe don't have everything planned out, it's good to keep your favorite fruits, vegetables, and proteins on hand. So you can buy these things fresh, frozen, or canned. Canned and frozen items will last longer than fresh varieties will. So if shelf life is a concern to you, you can always go that route. You can also intentionally buy fresh produce that has a long shelf life. Things like oranges and apples tend to last a long time. Root vegetables also last a long time. So things like potatoes, carrots, onions and garlic last for quite a while. So you can buy larger quantities of those and not necessarily worry about them going bad as quickly as, say, spinach, which notoriously wilts within like 2 days of you opening it. So definitely have a plan for that if you buy it. And then the other thing I'll say about having these things on hand is that you can also buy produce when it's in season and freeze it yourself to sort of reduce costs. So typically speaking, produce tends to be cheaper when it's in season. So if you figure out when the things you like to eat are in season, you can obviously freeze those things yourself and have them on hand for when they are no longer in season and no longer as cheap. So along with these basics, you'll want to keep ingredients on hand that will add flavor to whatever you cook. So this could be in the form of jarred sauces or spreads. I personally always have a jar of marinara sauce in my cabinet, as well as some sort of nut butter, whether it's peanut butter or almond butter. You should also keep some basic spices around. I've listed what I think are the absolute bare minimum basics to create a good meal. If you want additional recommendations for spices, definitely let me know and I can share that as well. So once you're stocked and ready to think about cooking, it's good to set some expectations for yourself ahead of time. So I would recommend identifying how much you want to spend on groceries. You can spend as little or as much as you're comfortable with. And I've listed here a few things that you want to take into consideration as you're thinking about what this number might be. So it can depend on a few factors. This may include your dietary expectations and needs. So if you have specific items you can't eat and you're often buying alternatives, you'll want to know what the general cost of those items are if you're buying them frequently. Additionally, your budget costs will depend on the cost of living where you're learning this semester. So to give an example, I'm originally from Kansas City, so from the Midwest. And when I moved to Philly for school, I had to completely shift my mindset about how much groceries should cost because it was slightly more expensive than I was used to. And then you'll also want to account for any logistical costs that you may face in your grocery shopping process. So this might be delivery fees if you've stopped visiting stores in person during the pandemic, or if you're still going to stores and you need to use public transportation to get there, it could be the cost of those fares. Now, the question we get most often is how much should I spend on this specific category, which in this case is groceries. Unfortunately, our answer is always we can't really tell you what you should be spending because it's so personal and depends on your needs and circumstances. That being said, I can tell you a little bit about what my habits were when I was a student, and then another way you can think about your grocery spending. So when I was a student, I spent probably about $50 a week on groceries, so around $200 a month. And I guess to give context for like what led to that amount, my meal planning strategy generally is to focus on buying fresh produce and protein with carbs here and there. I also cook a lot and I don't buy a lot of processed or pre-cut ingredients. So buying them in whole varieties and prepping them myself led to pretty low costs generally. Again, this depends on your comfort level and how much time you want to dedicate to that. Something else to take into consideration is that I've always shared grocery costs with roommates because we cooked and ate together. So we were able to spread some of those costs between a few people. Now, I spend slightly more than that, probably around $75 per week. Sometimes it's more, but generally that's around the area. Now, again, those are not numbers you need to strive for or sort of base your spending around, but that's just to give you a sense of what a budget for a student could look like. And then another resource you can always use to help you identify the standard cost of your groceries is the cost of attendance that's provided to you by Penn. So whether you receive a refund for your grocery expenses or not, you can take a look at your cost of attendance to get an idea of how much you should be spending based on that number and based on where you're learning from this semester. And something to remember is that the number listed in the cost of attendance is an annual number, so you'll need to calculate how that spreads out monthly or weekly. So split it in half to get the semesterly amount of the food item in the cost of attendance, and then you can split it up monthly or weekly from there. And if you need help with that, you can always email Financial Wellness and we can talk about more about how to budget those amounts. So now that you have the tools you need in your kitchen and in your budget, let's talk about the next big step, which is creating a meal plan. And before we move forward, I just want to clear the air about meal planning, sort of in the same way we do about budgeting. It doesn't have to be intense. It doesn't have to take a ton of your time. Meal planning should be effective for you personally. You should do it to the extent that you need to. So this is 100% customizable to your needs. And the key to success in saving money on groceries is meal planning, which is why we're talking about it. And you want to have a meal plan that you won't get bored of, but is still simple enough that you can follow through on it. And to be completely transparent with you, this is also my biggest weakness. I get bored with meals that I've prepped pretty quickly. So we'll discuss some strategies to help you with that if that is something you also struggle with. So first, let's talk about the basic steps. First, you want to take inventory of whatever food you already have at home already. So if you stocked your kitchen, like we mentioned before, you might have those kinds of items on hand and anything else that you've cooked with before. You want to make sure you check the fridge, the freezer, and the pantry, and pay attention to when things will go bad as well. Second, based on your eating habits and schedule, you want to identify how many meals you actually need to plan. Maybe you already have plans to order takeout one or a few days this week, or you know a meal will be provided to you by someone else. Maybe you don't typically eat breakfast, so you really only need to plan lunch and dinners and maybe some snacks here and there. You will know for yourself what these times are and when you need to plan meals for. Just have a list of about how many meals you need to plan for. Third, make a list of the meals you want to cook. And when you do this, think about the inventory that you took in step one. So again, if there are ingredients that need to be used up quickly because they're going bad sooner, center those in your plans. And if you ever have something that you don't really know how to use, you can always Google search like how to use this ingredient or recipes with this ingredient. This is something I deal with pretty often. And that's sort of how I go about it. But that can reduce food waste over time. And then lastly, based on the meals that you have written out that you're going to cook, create a list of the needed ingredients and cross-check with your inventory to create your grocery list. So make sure you're not duplicating what you already have on hand. Remove anything from your grocery list that you already have within your home. So now that we've talked about the basics of meal planning, here are some additional tips to help you succeed in your meal plan. First, always be real with yourself. I think this is the absolute most important part of meal planning. Know your schedule, know your cooking abilities, know how much time you can and want to dedicate to cooking at home, and then plan accordingly. You won't have time to cook a 3-course meal between your classes. Plan simple meals that you can cook quickly and prep ingredients in advance when you can to cut cooking time. Basically, don't make it hard for yourself if it doesn't have to be. And then on that note, plan meals with similar ingredients and ingredients that have many purposes. So this is good for a lot of reasons. One, it reduces food waste because you'll use up all or almost all of an ingredient that you bought to cook with. This is something I really struggled with when I started cooking as a student, is I would buy way more produce than I could possibly eat in a week because I thought I needed that much. And so I learned over time how much I actually needed, but it can take some time to figure out how much you actually need to buy. So just sort of, I guess, prepare yourself for that journey if you haven't cooked before. And then additionally, planning meals with similar ingredients can reduce time spent cooking. So when you prep an ingredient for one meal and you're planning on using that ingredient for another meal later in the week, while you already have it out and you're prepping it, you can take an extra minute or two to prep that second portion that you need for the meal that you're cooking later in the week. Then once you get to that point, it's already prepped, it reduces your cooking time, and you have a plan for it. You know it's going to get used and not wasted. And then my last point with this is avoid meals that require ingredients that you won't use elsewhere. To give a personal anecdote, something I almost always end up wasting is cabbage. So you buy this giant head that seems to be endless, and it's almost nearly impossible for me to use it all. So now if I find a recipe I want to make that has cabbage, I either make sure I have a plan for the rest of it, or I find some alternative and don't cook with it at all. So just keep that in mind as you're making plans. Not everything has to be a big extravagant meal. You can keep it simple and still be satisfied. So within that same idea, I want to highlight that batch cooking is totally your friend. If you have the storage space, you can cook large batches of ingredients and multi-purpose them throughout the week. This is great for things like grains and proteins that hold up well in the refrigerator or freezer. When you cook them at first, you can also choose to season them pretty simply so that you can adjust the flavor between meals. So I think rice is a really good example of this. You can cook it simply at first and then repurpose it for a bunch of things later in the week. And then my last point is that if you don't know what to include in your meal plan when you're making it, you can look online for ideas. You can ask friends and family, or just think about, the meals you might like to eat when you go out, and sort of look for recipes for those meals. It doesn't have to be complicated. I think oftentimes this can be one of the most challenging parts, is thinking about what you actually want to eat and planning that in advance, because you might not always know. So this might take a bit of practice. So then once you've made your meal plan, you are ready to go grocery shopping. So we've got some tips to share for your time spent in the store. First, eat before you shop. I cannot stress this enough. Do not shop on an empty stomach. You will make way more impulse purchases than you intended. And I would recommend plan for your impulses ahead of time. So this brings me to my second point, which is always have a list. This will come from your meal planning process, and you should also include snacks on your list, which you may not have put in your meal plan. Please, please, please give yourself room to be human and buy things that don't fit neatly into your plan. but just know what they are ahead of time. I think as an example, to be completely honest with you, like I buy a bag of hot Cheetos with my groceries every week because I know I'll snack on it throughout the week. If you've included something on your list, it's no longer an impulse. Again, this goes back to the point of knowing yourself and knowing what you hope to get out of this. My next tip is to look for sales when possible, but don't overdo it. And the reason I say don't overdo it is because sales can obviously be really great to reduce your grocery budget, but they also function in a way that can be really unhealthy for us. So, thinking about all the sales that are available may lead you to sort of stressing out over trying to get the absolute lowest price. You don't need to go to 5 different stores to get the cheapest groceries, though if you like doing that, more power to you, you should. You don't need to buy something just because it's on sale either. So stick to your list. Sales have this effect of making us feel like we're saving money on something when it's on sale. But if you weren't planning on buying that item in the first place, you're spending more money than you initially planned on and not actually saving that money. So just think about that when you see sales. If you see a sale for an item you were planning on purchasing anyway, that is amazing. Congrats. But don't go out of your way to purchase items on sale if you weren't planning on buying them anyway. And then don't be afraid to compare prices either. So this could be between stores or it could be between brands. And I want to highlight that you can compare price per unit as well, not just the sticker price. So in most grocery stores, they will list not only the sticker price, but also the price per ounce. This depends on what the item is and sort of how it's measured. Different items can look cheaper when you look at just the sticker price, but you may actually just be buying a smaller quantity. And if you only need that small quantity, that's fine. But looking at price per unit will give you a better sense of what's actually cheaper or what's actually more expensive overall. And then additionally, look above and below eye level to find the best prices. So grocery stores intentionally stock shelves so that the most expensive items are the ones that your eyes will gravitate to the easiest. So look around to get a better sense of all of your options and to minimize spending. So by now, you are totally a meal planning and grocery shopping pro. We want to share some additional tools to help you even further. So first, I want to say that our program will be releasing a guide that covers basically everything we've talked about today. It'll be available on our website through a tab called Financial Wellness Toolkit. And we can actually follow up with everyone who attended today to share this resource once it's up on the website. We have also listed a guide here from The Kitchen, which is an online resource, about how to meal prep effectively. So this is a really thorough guide, structured in a similar way to this presentation, and can give you some more things to take into consideration as you are thinking about your grocery plans. And I also want to say, because these things are linked here, we will be sharing the slides with everyone after the presentation, so you will be able to actually click on the links and access them. And then we also wanted to share a few food blogs to give you inspiration, like we talked about earlier. So the 2 we've listed here focus specifically on cooking on a budget. Check them out. Feel free to look for others on your own as well. I will say with Budget Bites, at the very least, with each recipe they post, they also list how much that recipe costs per serving, so you can get a sense that way if that's how you like to think about your grocery spending. And then lastly, if you feel like all the information we shared today was great, but you still don't feel confident in your cooking skills, please know that YouTube has so many cooking tutorials you can view. That's where I learned how to roast a chicken, which I do really frequently now. You can find super simple tutorials. BuzzFeed's Tasty channel offers some, and there are also some from famous chefs like Gordon Ramsay, who offer the cooking tutorials through their YouTube channels. So definitely look at that as a resource. So, all right, it looks like we have at least one question in the chat. So I'm just going to say a few closing remarks and then we'll take Q&A. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope we were able to answer some of your questions about cooking on a budget. Again, please send any questions you have and we'll address them shortly. Before folks begin to leave, I want to direct your attention to the evaluation form we've linked here. You can pull out your phone or another browser tab to go to the link listed to complete an evaluation for this workshop. We really value this feedback and it's crucial for us to improve our workshops for future audiences, so please fill it out. Okay, so we have a question. Do you have tips on how to reduce time spent cooking? What stops me from cooking frequently is knowing how long it takes to chop / preheat / roast, etc. what I'm making. I am totally with you. So I think there are a few ways you can approach this. So one is the sort of like meal prep approach where you just set aside some time, maybe on the weekend, to prep these things in advance so that when you get to the times in the week where you actually need to follow through in cooking them, they're already prepped. This works well for some ingredients and not always others. Truly, my tip for how to reduce time spent cooking is to plan meals that don't require much time. So I think what's most important is to identify, the meals you like to eat most often, and try to find ways to speed them up. The other thing I would say is the more confident you get in cooking, the less time it will take. As an example, when I first started cooking, I would try to roast vegetables and I would spend literally like 2 hours chopping vegetables because I was so insecure about my knife skills and I thought I would like chop my finger off. And now I feel much more confident in that. And so it takes a lot less time than it did before. So, referencing some of the tips we gave throughout the presentation, I would say that concept of like prepping one ingredient for multiple uses is another way to sort of get that out of the way. So I think some ingredients that are in a lot of meals are things like onions, or carrots or something like that. Those are ingredients that store pretty well in the fridge after you have prepped them already. So if you go that route, you know that they won't be gross by the time you want to use them later in the week. Any other questions about grocery shopping on a budget or how to cook? We'd be happy to answer them. Okay, well, if no one has any other questions, we can wrap up. Feel free to, we'll stick around for a few minutes if you have questions and we can answer them after. We hope to see you at future sessions. And please email us if you do have more specific questions about this. We'd be happy to talk to you about it. Thanks, everyone.